And with those inspirational words from our speakers, it's time to dig a little deeper, to set the scene. Let's take a leap back in time and explore the circumstances that led to the establishment of this institution, the Nordic Investment Bank.
The 5 Nordic ministers sign an agreement. An idea discussed for a quarter century becomes a joint financial institution, the Nordic Investment Bank.
Facilitate coordination of major projects, contribute to financing investment, big investment projects and exports in Nordic interest. That was simple as that.
How did we get here? Post-war Europe needed economic cooperation and long-term capital. The Nordics kept asking, could we create a Nordic instrument to raise foreign capital to the region and modernize industry? The Nordic Economic Cooperation Council proposed a Nordic customs union and an investment bank to finance projects of common Nordic interest. However, this was rejected in 1959 due to perceived uneven economic benefits. Also, the bank idea was put on hold. In 1963, France's president vetoes UK's European Economic Community entry, leaving Denmark and Norway to withdraw their applications due to their reliance on the UK market. The Nordic bank idea resurfaced in the Nordic Council's debates. However, benefits still looked uneven. Strong for Finland and Iceland, unclear for the others. The momentum faded. Then came Nordic, the Nordic Economic Union, envisioning a common market, shared policies, and a joint Nordic investment bank. Then, days before the planned signing of the Nordec Agreement, Finland withdrew in March 1970, in a move widely understood to reflect incompatibility with its relations to the Soviet Union. Yet another attempt at Nordic economic cooperation collapsed.
When the Nordic collapsed, the bank idea collapsed too.
After the Nordic failure in 1971, the newly founded Nordic Council of Ministers focused on more pragmatic politics, leaving grand schemes aside. After the 1973 oil shock, the case hardened: attract capital, finance energy, and back exports. It was urgent. In January 1975, the Nordic prime ministers asked for a concrete plan as soon as possible. A group chaired by Hermod Scanlon delivered. A bank on sound banking principles designed to complement markets. Ministers said, proceed as soon as possible. To avoid another slow fade, the governments called the first ever extraordinary session of the Nordic Council. After hard debate, economics, regional balance, international obligations, the vote in November 1975 was clearly in favor of establishing the Nordic Investment Bank. The governments cleared the last hurdles, and on 4th of December in 1975, the agreement was signed in Copenhagen. Helsinki became the headquarters, bringing Finland closer to Nordic cooperation and balancing institutions across the region. From idea to instrument, in 1975, the Nordic countries finally decided to combine credit strength for common goals, a decision that has endured for 50 years.
That has endured for 50 years. What an amazing short stroll back in history. I actually miss those old typewriters when I see some video from back then. To dive a little bit deeper into the history and the achievements, it's time for our first debate today. Please help me welcoming our panelists and our moderator that will walk on stage together. From the University of Oslo, postdoctoral fellow and the author of NIB History, Byron Rom Jensen. From Sweden, the State Secretary to the Swedish Minister for Finance, Johanna Lybeck Lilja, and former President and CEO of NIB, Henrik Norman. And to facilitate this discussion will be moderated by the Head of Communication at NIB, Jukka Ahonen. Please welcome them all to stage. welcome everyone. And Jukka, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Lilian. And we can go down to business now when you introduce us. By the way, the song that you heard at the beginning, this ABBA's fantastic song from 1975, if you look at the title, the exact title of this song, it is I do, I do, I do, I do, I do. It's 5 times I do. It was also 5 governments in 1975 which said I do for the Nordic Investment Bank to start the financial marriage and the partnership, which has now lasted 50 years. And you saw the black and white pictures of those Nordic cooperation ministers at the beginning. I must say they were boosted a little bit with the AI, but I'm really, really happy that Minister Adlercreutz came here to give the welcoming address. It was very symbolic to come here to Copenhagen 50 years later with the welcoming address by the presidency of the Nordic Council of Ministers. So thank you for that. At the NIB, we normally do things quite comprehensively, so we just don't look at old pictures, but we want to dig in a little bit deeper. And this is also what we have done this time. So we wanted actually to understand what's going on. What was the discussion about the bank? What is the history of the bank? There was a big gap because this history did not exist. And this is why Byron Rom Jensen has worked very diligently for a long time to write the history of the Nordic Investment Bank. And if there is some magic now happening, there could be a QR code. So I'm sure that you are all very, very eagerly now taking your phones and scanning the history and reading it. But please read it after this, this discussion. But now, I will start with Byron. How did you get interested in the Nordic Investment Bank so much that you wanted to write the history of the bank?
Yeah, thank you, Jukka. Well, personally, I was working on an investigation of a series of Nordic-Baltic conferences that were taking place in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And the Nordic Investment Bank had a very special role in these conferences. They provided, well, in the very first conference, they provided the initial loan as part of the conference. It's a very symbolic act. It sets the agenda for the rest of the conferences. And I'll be frank, I had never heard of the Nordic Investment Bank before. But I was intrigued, and I wanted to know more. And the more I read, the more intrigued I became. Because you have all these major events of Nordic-Baltic history in the last 50 years, and in so many of them, the Nordic Investment Bank is there in some capacity. So I was thrilled when the Nordic Investment Bank approached me about writing this book. It seemed the ideal way to get to know an organization.
There was something interesting you told me when you went first time to the archives. What did you find?
Yeah, well, it was one of my first trips down to the archive. I was going through the minutes of the Nordic Investment Bank's leadership group. And there's a discussion about how they need to get their archives in order. And it's not just so they can find the documentation they need, but as they wrote, it was also for future historical interest. And that felt like I was fulfilling something that was long-standing. I was making a contract also with the past to tell this story, to tell Nordic Investment Bank's story.
All right, then last question before we move on. The first chapter is called Long Roads to the Nordic Investment Bank. So very briefly, why did it take such a long time to establish the bank, and what were the final triggers?
Yeah. No, it's a good question because, I mean, we're talking about 25 years from when a Nordic Investment Bank is first proposed to when it's actually created there. I mean, I know things move slowly in politics, but that seems excessive there. So I think that the film there had several of those factors, but the Nordic Investment Bank kept being proposed as part of wider plans for Nordic economic integration. As Karin said, the Nordics have something in common, but those plans also created a sense of skepticism, a sense of distrust. For example, in Norway, there was fears of economic domination by Swedish manufacturing. So when those plans fell through, as they eventually did, it left Nordic Investment Bank essentially on the shelf. But it wasn't just internal skepticism, there was also external factors at play here as well. You have the bipolarity of the Cold War, pulling the Nordic region in different directions. You had the European question, because it was clear that Denmark and Norway, and to some extent Sweden, were interested in joining the European Economic Community. But what was not clear was how would a Nordic Investment Bank affect an application like that? So you had several roadblocks, and what made 1975 a sort of sweet spot for actually creating a bank was several of those issues had been resolved. And also, as was mentioned, there was a crisis, the 1973 OPEC oil crisis, created an incentive to work together to spread financing around the region. The discovery of oil and gas in the North Sea also created an incentive to find a way to invest that money. The European question had largely been resolved. Denmark joins the EEC in 1973. The other countries stay out. There doesn't seem to be any immediate movement on that front. But on the other hand, what that means for the future of Nordic cooperation is unclear. There's still Nordic cooperation in this setting? Does it have a future? And there's an incentive to show, yes, it's still alive and kicking. There is still vitality in the Nordic project. And then just lastly, it was really significant that it was an independent proposal for a Nordic Investment Bank, rather than a larger project to recharacterize or recalibrate Nordic economies through greater integration. That made it a lot more palatable, a lot less risky there.
All right, thank you, Byron. Now we move to Henrik. When the bank was established, you were a 20-plus history student. So an interesting detail about Henrik Norman is that he has a background, he has studied history, which is not the case with many bankers. But when you were studying history, you were certainly looking what's happening in the societies. How did you see, as a young man, how did you see the Nordic cooperation, and could NIB have been something for you that, hey, I would like to work for NIB?
Let me start with the last question. To become a banker was not on the radar screen. It's completely not to become a banker. If you look at television and if you look at movies, the crook is always a banker, or at least it's a dubious character. Or if it is a romantic movie, then the douchehead that the girl will leave at the end is, of course, a banker for somebody creative. So therefore, to become a banker was not on the screen. And at that time, in '75, I will say my own interest, was very keen on Nordic cooperation, but with the election and also the referendum in Denmark in '72 and joining EEC in '73, let me say the prayer rocks moved towards the south, to Brussels, and that was more where the debate was. So no, to my humble, it was a mistake. I didn't see it as important. Sorry.
Okay, and then some years later you became the president.
Yes, but but it shows you a bit about human. We can learn, and we can be better.
Yes.
That's okay. No, but may I just say a few words? You're absolutely right. I learned something about banking studying history as well. And then when I became a banker, I actually found out that banking is not so much about numbers. Banking is about dreams. People come into you, they ask you, can I afford to buy a motorbike? And then you can say yes, but you can't afford the petrol. So you can help people, and you can start with the bike, you can go to the house, you can go to buying companies. So your key job is to ensure that that person's dream doesn't become a nightmare. And you see, that is where the fascination of Nordic Investment Bank, that it is the political dream that we can do something together, that should not become a nightmare because it should be done on sound banking principles. And that was the fascination.
Very good. It's good to continue on that topic with Johanna Lübeck-Lilja, who is not only representing Sweden here, but also representing the Board of Governors of the Nordic Investment Bank. I'm sure that you have a lot to say what NIB should do now, but let's stay a little bit in the 70s. So How do you view the establishment of the bank from the historical perspective, and what was it in for Sweden, if you think about the Swedish approach at the time?
Yeah. Well, several questions in one. I'm thinking about Henrik. You know, I've also been a banker. When we become more knowledgeable, we can change our mind.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, but so we saw very well in the video that the times when NIB was founded was economic turbulent times. With the oil crisis, energy prices went up, and then of course all the Nordic countries realized that we need to invest in energy projects. Well, we need finance for that. And the problem at the time, and it's easy to forget, as we are now very market-based economies, is that all the Nordic financial markets were really heavily regulated at the time. So we had a financing gap that we needed to fill, and it wasn't that easy. And as we heard, the deeper Nordic cooperation has been on the agenda for decades at the time, including a Nordic customs union was discussed. But as we've also heard, this was far from uncontested. So there was a lot of worries and criticism from all sides of the political spectrum, because this is a political project in the end. So the conservatives were extremely worried that this would be a sort of state-driven, inefficient, and overlap with commercial banks. So that was their concern. And if you look at the Social Democrats, they were worried that this would strengthen the private capital or the private banks. So they were worried. Some felt that it had been rushed through with no proper economic analysis. And then we also heard from the video, and that's our experience as well, some were concerned that this would actually sort of exacerbate the imbalances between the countries. So there would be less money diverted to poorer regions. But for Sweden, this, I would say, was a sort of long-term standing commitment to Nordic cooperation. And also, of course, it was very unstable times that we haven't seen since then until now. But now we're back in unstable times. And for the Social Democrats of Sweden, who were in power at the time, they thought of it as a way to show the strength of the Nordic cooperation. It was a political symbol in that. But then, of course, we have the other advantages: risk sharing, diverting capital to the projects that are politically prioritized, infrastructure, energy, and those kinds of things.
Thanks. That's actually a good bridge to maybe to the next point, because there was a very extraordinary discussion in the Nordic Council in Stockholm that year. And Byron, maybe you could just reflect at what were the basic pros and cons. They were a little bit reflecting what Johanna said, but...
Yeah, I mean, it was intense. As Johanna said, there was significant dividing lines. I mean, the Nordic Council had been increasingly ideological in this period. And there was a lot of skepticism about whether a bank really was necessary. Do you need to create new institutions to save Nordic cooperation? Or could you use more sort of ad hoc measures? And so, as Johanna said, you had, on one side, a conservative faction that also saw it as much more harmful. It was harmful to commercial institutions. It would take business away, it would take financing away. And then on the left, from the communists and left-leaning socialists, they didn't feel it was harmful enough. It wasn't taking enough business away. And the response from the supporters was to sort of point out that dichotomy. Trygve Bratteli, who is the Norwegian Social Democratic Prime Minister, has this line during the meeting where he says, essentially, the two sides, the communists and the conservatives, are each sailing in their own direction, and then they rediscover each other a bit to their own horror. Where they've ended up is this desert island where nothing grows. So the supporters are instead insisting that, no, this is a way of promoting Nordic cooperation, right? This is a way of bringing in financing. This is a way of showing that we are united. It's a bit vague, in fact, and there's a reason for that, and that's because nobody's actually done an economic viability study to see if this idea in 75 will work, what the impact will be, because they are afraid of creating a long process. They want to get this idea out. They don't want it to die the same death of other processes. And it works. I mean, this moves quick. This is ratified by the parliaments. It moves to the Nordic Council, despite the fact that no one's really sure what the impact of a Nordic Investment Bank will be, or even really what it's going to do. I mean, it's going to work for the Nordic interest. What's that? We'll find out later.
All right, thank you. I don't know, Henrik or Johanna, could you imagine that there would be such a political, intensive, passionate debate about the bank today?
Well, my short answer is no, because none of the risks that were feared have actually materialized. So for us, it's very easy. We see the value and the value added of NIB, clearly.
Yeah. I'll just say win-win. And that is the political debate. If it is very ideological, they don't see that NIB, as you were saying, you put it very well, as additionality is the key point. And may I just give an example? Financial crisis, 2010-11, commercial banks, they can do more or less the same as we can, but no, they can't really. We could come with long-term financing to industry. So where the banks were pulling back and saying you can get a 3-year loan, we could give a 5, 7, 10-year loan. The longest loan we gave in that period was actually to one of the Baltic countries for railways, 30-year loan. No commercial bank could do that. So, additionality, I agree.
Very good, very good. Let's stay the last point regarding the founding of NIB and the history of NIB. Let's look at, I have one interesting video clip for you.
Can we?
It was very controversial because 3 countries wanted to have their headquarters: Norway, Sweden and Finland. And Finland had initially no support at all from anyone except for the Finnish government. But step by step, Finland convinced the others. We have no big Nordic institution. You all have a big Nordic institution. We have none. It's an argument that is difficult to beat. And second, I think, of the Swedish thinking under Prime Minister Palme, he didn't push Stockholm as a headquarter. I think he was quite pleased actually having Helsinki as the headquarter because he said it will tie Finland more closely to the Nordic community and take a little step away from Moscow.
So a little step away from Moscow. So that was, of course, Bengt Dennis. I'm sure that Johanna, you know him. He's a very significant figure in the Swedish economic history, and all the Swedes probably know him here. Just to check a little bit with Byron, do you agree with what he was saying when you have been doing research? And then maybe what were the arguments against Helsinki?
Yeah, I think Bengt has it right as far as I can tell from the records there. I mean, 1975, you have to remember, the Nordic Council of Ministers has just been created a few years before, which leaves all the Nordic countries with a permanent institution of Nordic cooperation, except for Finland. And Finland rightfully says, well, what about us? It's our turn, right? We should get the bank. And there is a lot of hostility to that. There is a lot of skepticism. Finland is seen as just too peripheral. You won't be able to attract international financing to Finland. You won't be able to attract staff to Finland who wants to go work in Helsinki. And I mean, this is also in the middle of the Cold War, so the proximity to the Soviet Union is concerning. As one social democratic politician has reported, have said in a Norwegian newspaper, Finland, it just smells too much of the East over there.
Thanks, Byron.
Smells better now.
I remember actually there was one quote. Some of these politicians said that the spoiled Scandinavian bankers will not move to Helsinki. Spoiled Scandinavian bankers. Henrik, are you a spoiled Scandinavian banker?
Unfortunately, I've never been spoiled, but I was very happy to move to Helsinki. I visited Helsinki. Remember, I'm coming from Copenhagen. Copenhagen is cold, it's damp, it's dark, and it is overtaxed. And then you come to Helsinki, where at least at winter time there is snow and the sun is shining from time to time. But Helsinki, of course, you have your worries. It is difficult to attract staff, but I'll say it's a fallacy. It's a beautiful city, and I really enjoyed working there.
Johanna, do you have something to add? It seemed to be that Sweden had a very
No,
big role.
I was sitting here getting worried that I would have to contradict Ben Danish, because you don't contradict central bank governors, right? But then he saved it in the end, because at least what we can find in the notes we have, is that Sweden was actually pushing for Helsinki to be the headquarters. And that was the geopolitical side of things, strengthening Finland. And I agree, Helsinki is a beautiful city. But now I think it makes even more sense with the extension to the Baltic states.
Exactly.
Because now you have the proximity of all the owner countries.
Yes, now we can jump a little bit forward in time. You mentioned the Baltic countries, which joined the NIB, of course, 2005. And by the way, the book that I mentioned, that will be published as a whole book next year in September, August-September, when we are going to celebrate the 50 years since the start of operations of the Nordic Investment Bank. When you have been writing the book, Byron, what has been the red thread throughout this 50 years of the Nordic Investment Bank? And what are your major takeaways when you look at the whole area, 50 years?
That's a good question. I guess my major takeaway was just how important in 1975 it was that they created a new institution, a permanent institution. Because as I mentioned, there was several other proposals to create more ad hoc measures to bolster Nordic financial cooperation, new agreements, lowering regulation in certain areas, liberalizing monetary flows. But these kinds of ad hoc measures, and not just in financial cooperation, also in other kinds of cooperation, they tend to lose their drive. They tend to be abandoned as circumstances change. And then when circumstances change again, as circumstances are wont to do, then there needs to be the sense of rediscovery of how do we work together. But institutions have staying power. They're different. You have not just a structure, but you have an institutional memory that goes along with institutions, about how have we cooperated in the past, what has worked, what hasn't, and how can we cooperate going forward. And I hope the book will also be able to contribute to that institutional memory of how has NIB worked in the past, and provide then the Baltic and Nordic members a institution they can turn to when new challenges arise, and that institutional memory becomes relevant again.
Thanks. Henrik, you have a very long experience in private banking at NIB. I would like to ask you a little bit about the relevance of the IFIs like the Nordic Investment Bank. Where are those? What do you think are the periods when these kind of institutions have been most needed?
It's a bit of a difficult question to answer precisely, so I'm sorry, I'll take a little detour. In order to run an efficient bank, you have to have process all the time. You have to renew systems, you have to visit customers, you have to understand customers. Where IFIs really make a difference if something dramatic happens in the world. The financial crisis, I mentioned there that we could go in and we also gave loans to smaller banks because we could fund themselves and they had funding issues. Then came COVID, nobody knew what to do. We were reasonably adept due to a flexible board, and we could give 3 loans to the Baltic states who had budget issues. And our chair can, for the board of directors, can say a few words about that in question time. So you have every 3 to 5 years something happens that is unforeseen where the commercial banks cannot really act. So that, I think, is the key point. But if you don't do business in between, you are sunk, and that is why you have to have a diversified portfolio. Then you have to ask yourself, are there too many IFIs? And there we can debate that if you want to, that I believe in the clock or the church tower principles, that it's a good thing that you can walk up and then you can see and you know your environment. And that is where the Nordic Investment Bank is a strong bank, because we are having a strong board who knows their business. And the last thing I think where the IFI is also bringing something together, that is, it was mentioned that somebody was afraid that Sweden would dominate. I can tell you in my 9 years, I've never ever heard one saying, this is against our interest to give a loan that way. It might be for mandate reasons, environmental reasons and others, but they have never thought nationalistic. And there's a good debate, so I will say this in Danish now. Meninger brydes, og sød musik opstår. And that's the key point, that people are meeting of something specific, and I think that enhances Nordic cooperation.
But maybe before we come to you, Johanna, is there something you think that should be changed or continuously developed?
No, but the change is that the board, there should be this dialogue between the board and the banking side on the mandate. I would personally be very disappointed if the environment is on a mandate 50 years from now, because that should be common business in all companies, in all municipalities, for all states. It should not be something special. It should be ingrained, but there we are doing something. So.
Thanks. Johanna, same question to you. Are there some particular periods in time when the institutions like NIB are especially needed, and how do you keep these institutions relevant?
Yep. To complement Henrik, I think you have picked the period where we actually need the IFIs, and that is when we need counter-cyclical lenders to maintain lending in problematic times.
Good word.
I mean, crisis, COVID, and things like that. But I would mention two more. One is when we have sort of very big economic transitions, and you can think about either technological shifts, and then I'm thinking about climate investments, for one thing. The other is, of course, political shifts. And that would be the Baltic states' independence. That is very important. But now, when I look at NIB, I would argue that what we need now is large-scale, long-term financing and coordination for prioritized areas, and now that is defense capabilities. So I'm exceptionally proud and happy that NIB is actually the IFI that has gone the furthest into defense capabilities, also investing in weapons and ammunition production. None of the other IFIs do that today. So it's actually a very big achievement, and we're trying to push the others to follow in NIB's suit. But to remain relevant, I mean, you have to adapt. The world changes. There's no inherent sort of right to exist, but you have to adapt. And I think NIB has shown that very clearly, that we are ready to adapt when the world changes. But it's also important to keep sort of our standards, governance, transparency, AAA rating. We don't want to complement other IFIs. We don't want to complement, we want to complement other IFIs, not compete with them. We want to complement market participants, not compete with them. And I think NIB has shown in practice that they are agile. And now particularly with defense, because that makes me really strong, proud.
Any comment, Henrik?
No, I concur, so it's very well put, so nothing to add.
All right. Now this marriage has lasted like 50 years. What is the secret for happy marriage after these 50 years? Maybe, Byron.
Yeah, I think it's that kind of understanding that, well, looking back, I guess, about the previous 50 years, it's been the, as Henrik mentioned, the uncomplicated nature of this lack of power struggle, this lack of really the kind of potential infighting and the disassociation between different regimes that you find in other, well, in some other cases, in other IFIs. And that sort of uncomplicated, almost even boring nature, I think is really the secret sauce, you could say, with NIB's previous 50 years, and hopefully the secret sauce for the 50 years to come.
Henrik, secret to happy marriage?
Look at the US Marines. Adapt, improvise, overcome. You will have problems, overcome them. You will have suitors who would look at you and they look better than yourself, so your wife will look at them. Then go to the fitness center and improve. And therefore, you basically have to look at the internal machinery, be on the top. That's why we need a board that puts pressure on management. Pressure is a good thing. And then adjust the mandate so we are relevant. Because if I was a politician, you have other IFIs, and if we're doing exactly the same thing, why? But I personally think that smaller IFIs have the agility because it's a small board; they can agree quicker, and and then number two, remember NIB is a circular economy. It's the only large IFI that pays a dividend. So you get the money back you invest. And all politicians should think about that. You get your money back. So you can do something new. Whereas if it goes to some of the others, it goes down in a big, big hole.
All right. Thank you, Henrik. And the last question to Johanna, who is of course representing the highest decision-making body here, that how do we make sure that the marriage will stay happy?
I would say, remember why you fell in love in the first place.
Oh, that's romantic.
And honestly, that is that we have shared values and common goals. I mean, we are so similar. I mean, I meet people from countries all across the world. And when I look at the Nordic-Baltic region, we are historically similar. We are geographically similar. We are culturally similar. It's not only that it's only 8 people in the board that have to fight. It's also the fact that we are so much alike. And we have the same priorities. We want to prioritize environment, we want to prioritize productivity, and now resilience. And we talked a little bit about it earlier, but I would argue, you hear I'm all into defense right now, it's actually sustainable to be able to defend yourself. So I would turn that around from some of the private banks. So Sweden, I would say, is as committed as we were in 1975, and I do not see any divorce in sight.
Thank you, that was fantastic to hear. So now I would like to open the floor for questions, and actually over to Lilian, who will take over from
Thank
here.
you so much, Jukka, and for all that good pieces of advice on how to stay happily married. Listening in, it made me wonder of a few things, but I'd just like to open to the audience. If anyone has questions, just raise your hand. I'll keep a lookout if you have questions for our panelists. Byron, I would like to start out by asking you, since you've been researching so intensively as a journalist, I love the word research, but looking back at the decision taken around the founding of NIB, what turned out to be more important at the decision-making time than anyone had actually anticipated, looking back?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm actually going to double back on a question or answer that's already been given, and that's to place the bank in Helsinki. I mean, we heard how potentially disruptive, how much of disagreement there was about placing a Nordic Investment Bank in Helsinki. What could not have been foreseen is those changes that took place at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s to place a bank that was seeming this sort of middle way, this middle point between Nordic and Baltic countries, to create a sense of being a Baltic Sea bank. It's difficult if they had, for example, placed the bank in Oslo. If the Nordic Investment Bank really would have developed the same sort of Baltic Sea identity that it eventually did. And that just could not have been foreseen. So that ended up being a very, again, a happy marriage there.
A happy marriage. And Johanna, you said you don't see a divorce in sight whatsoever. I was just wondering, talking about a strong marriage, still, if it should have been funded today, in response to these challenges that we are facing, as you said, we need to look many decades back to even find something similar. This is uncharted waters. Would you design it? Would you have designed it differently if it was today that you were here signing the agreement in Copenhagen when it comes to mandates or tools?
Good question. I would say that an institution like NIB is basically founded every day. because you have to constantly, continuously adapt. Otherwise, you will be phased out if you fulfill your mandate. Now, I'm being very harsh, I know that. But clearly, I think NIB's history shows that adaptation is both possible and necessary. So that's a good thing. So I don't think it's like 50 years ago and now it takes sort of a new turn on it. It's an ongoing process where we make decisions every day.
Thank you so much. And we have a question from the audience, I think is in the third row. There you go, just address your name and to whom you would like to ask a question.
Oh, yes, I am Merle Wilkinson. I'm a chair of the Nordic Investment Bank board representing Estonia. And I've been an NIB for many, many years. So it's actually, I would like now to hear, I very much enjoy the discussions you had about the marriage and changes over the time. So remember, the marriage is 50 years old. And it started as a video, like a Nordic interest. So I just was wondering, and Nordic cooperation, so over the 50 years, how do you see that, what has been the major changes over the 50 years of time? Like Johanna, you said resilience and so on, adapting to the changes, but facts just over the 50 years time, what would you see that's been the highlights, or just name the things? You can say Baltics, for example, because I'm representing Baltics, and that's what I've been hoping you to say. Thank you.
Who would like to start by responding? Johanna?
I can start. I mean, I think we all share the view here that the world constantly changes. And we can't do much about it. I mean, someone said that Nordic influence should be bigger. I was in London a couple of weeks ago, and then they said that Sweden should have 50% of the votes in the European Council. I thought that was an excellent idea. But maybe others wouldn't. But so clearly, 1975, we were talking about how can we produce more oil. Now we're talking about the complete opposite. How can we phase out fossil? Yeah. So that has changed, and NIB's changed with it. And then I would say clearly now, the last 3 years, in this exceptionally unstable global world order that we see, NIB is a provider of stability. So in these times, we need NIB more than ever.
Henrik, Byron, you want to elaborate?
No, I'm just thinking it's a very difficult question how the Nordic cooperation has developed. I'm thinking about a Danish prime minister who visited Obama, and then Obama, he was very nice, and he said to the prime minister, Denmark is punching above its weight. Then there was somebody checking on Obama, and he had said that to 59 countries or so, that they were doing that. So I think the key thing for Nordic cooperation, which has been learned, is that we all, particularly the Danes who have a superior complex, we should look in the mirror and say we are a small country, but together we can do much more. Remember, our GDP in the region is the same more or less as Russia, a bit larger than Russia. So if we work together, and I think that has changed over the last 15 years in EU and other places, we are more seen as a group. I don't know whether I'm correct on that, but that's how I see it.
No, I completely agree.
Yeah. So look in the mirror and say, I'm small, but I want to be big by having good friends.
Byron?
Yeah, I mean, as it comes to Nordic Investment Bank, what we can do that's more has really changed in terms of what does it mean to work for a Nordic and eventually Nordic-Baltic interest. And the big difference is that early on, it was really about bringing Nordic businesses and Nordic value and Nordic capital out into the world, out into the international markets, and thus sort of participating in a spreading these kinds of Nordic ideas and Nordic interests. And you've seen a significant change there with the way that the sense that the NIB is working much more closely at bringing these larger ideas, these global values like sustainability into the Nordic region, part of something larger, and at the same time being able to make sure that this is in the Nordic interest and it is in Nordic-Baltic interest, and really giving it that sort of Nordic-Baltic twist to it too.
Speaking about the importance of punching above your weight, so to speak, and in our region as such, and you mentioned Obama and the US. I was a US correspondent from 2016 to 2023. I often say that 1 Trump year equals 7 journalist years, so I'm actually above 100 now, because of the pace, constantly something going on. I'm just wondering, in a world where multilateralism is under such big pressure, how important do you see this regional way of working together for the future? Johanna?
I think we have an excellent working cooperation, for one thing, but I also think we need to remember that we have other friends and allies also outside. Sometimes I'm going to the European Union, so we're discussing bi-European, but of course they mean EU. We have other friends, the UK, Canada, Japan, Australia, South Korea. So we need to be better at reaching out to those across the world that actually share our values and believe in an organized world where international law actually prevails.
Time is almost running. I just want to check that I didn't forget anyone in the audience. Then I'll actually address my last question to you, Henrik. You've been in the commercial banking and you've been with the NIB. Looking back, when would you say that the bank has been its most valuable to its member countries? And what would you say as an advice that cannot be lost for the next 50 years?
Let me start with the last question. I won't give advice because they have a great management at NIB and they have a great board, and therefore old CEOs, they should shut up. And so should politicians, by the way. But I'll just say, general terms, when you call yourself a bank, and I've just said we give 30-year loans, you have to do the basic banking skills. If you don't have that, also if you don't have license to operate an order, then you cannot change your mandate, because the loan that was given in 2015, that runs to 2045, just to put it in perspective, and then look at how much has changed. What was the other part of the question? Again, I was buying time now. What was the first part of the question? Sorry.
The first question was, when has it been the most successful to the member countries, NIB, looking back at the last 50 years?
That it still exists.
Sorry?
That it still exists.
That it still exists.
That's the success. It has had an effect to pinpoint one thing. You can't do that. You're a bank, you do many things. I've mentioned COVID. Small thing, we were the first bank that gave, outside Iceland, who gave a loan to Keflavik Airport. That was NIB, that brought other financiers in. Small things matters, and NIB matters. So you should be proud.
You should be proud, and small things matters.
Yes, they do.
And you shared a lot of the secret sauce to all of us. I would like to give a big round of applause to our panelists and our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.